Okay, so for the second set of notes for Unit 1, we're going to focus on settlements, alliances, and resistance. And so let's start with our vocabulary, just like we did in the first notes. And now we'll move on to the introduction. All right, so for well over 100 years after Columbus discovered the New World, Europeans spent more time trying to get around and through North America to reach Asia than they actually did spending time paying attention to the lands and resources that were available and what would later become the United States or Canada. So, for decades, most European contact with North America was limited to a specific industry, the industry of cod fishing, which was or had a huge demand in Europe. Fishermen from France, England, and regions of Spain would spend their summer months off the coast of Canada and Maine fishing. But by the late 1500s, however, some in England and France, as well as Spain, began to develop new interest in North America. From the settlements of Jamestown and Quebec, England and France would claim huge tracts of land that they would eventually come to dominate. The English would expand from a single tiny Jamestown colony to control most of the Atlantic coast north of Florida, which was Spanish, and west towards the Allegheny Mountains. In the 1500s, explorers had come and quickly departed from North America. In the 1600s, though, the Europeans began to stay. Initially, some Indian tribes saw Europeans as welcome trading partners or even military allies against other Native American tribes. But in the later years, the later 1600s, when settlements started to grow too quickly, diseases began to spread too rapidly, or the Europeans just became too demanding, that's when you start to see Indian resistance. So let's start with our first section, which are settlements, old and new. And we're going to start with the English settlement in North America. So when King James I was crowned King of England in 1603, he was anxious to make peace with Spain. So he decided to quickly end the royal support for legalized piracy. Queen Elizabeth had actually supported piracy and funded it. But anyways, investors seeking financial gain created the Virginia Company. And they advised the building of settlements to be some distance from the coast, so that way they could avoid a Spanish attack. But then also by being a little further inland, they could gain much knowledge of the food from the natives to survive. So within about 30 years, England had settled or claimed large territories, and their claims would continue to expand into the 1700s. So let's look at the first colony and the colonization of Virginia and Jamestown. You can see here on the map, Jamestown's just north of that lost colony of Roanoke. So in 1607, 105 men from the Virginia Company arrived in North America. They named their new community Jamestown in honor of King James. The company appointed a council of 6 to govern the colony and left it to the council to elect its own president. But things in Jamestown did not go well. The unhealthy conditions at the site of the colonists had selected along the James River ended up probably killing more of them than any other cause. Although they thought they had selected, as they said, a very fit place, they had in fact chosen a land with a terrible water supply. The water from the river was tidal and brackish, meaning it's got salt mixed into it, and you can actually go crazy from drinking too much salt water. As well as there was just a whole bunch of filth in that river. So in the years of 1607 and 1608, you see a really bad drought, which is going to lead to a severe shortage of food, and those winter years were also, colder than normal. So a lot of waterborne diseases occur, starvation weakens the bodies, and few of the English escape any type of sickness. The members of the council also constantly disagreed, and they even ended up executing one of the council members because they believed he was a Spanish spy. By 1608, only 38 of the 105 colonists that originally came to Jamestown were alive. Now, that's not the only problems that they had in Jamestown. Other problems are going to arise. So they had land that they built their colony on, thinking it was theirs, but we all know it wasn't. It was the Native Americans. So the natives were ruled by the Powhatan, who John Smith, which was a very experienced soldier, negotiated a deal for food to keep the colony and the colonists alive. Now, how did this happen? So Smith is wandering along the countryside one day when he's taken prisoner by the natives, and they're getting ready to execute him, okay? But the Powhatan daughter, Pocahontas, suddenly jumps out in front of John Smith. She's like, "You can't kill him," and so they grant him pardon. Now, we need to take a moment to talk about how Disney is wrong here. Pocahontas was 10 to 12 years old, and John Smith was 27 to 30 years old. So the love story that Disney portrays does not happen. Okay, even back then it was wrong. But Pocahontas does end up marrying another Englishman, traveling to England, catching smallpox, and I think she dies at about 23. So that pretty much gives you a pretty good overview of Jamestown and Virginia. So now let's move on to the next colony that's going to be founded by the English. Let's talk about this really quickly. Now, years later in Virginia, when the colony was once again struggling to survive, there was a shift from trading with the natives to growing tobacco. Now, the new emphasis on agriculture also meant many from England would settle in Virginia, but then they would need to farm the land. Now, the shift also changes the lives of thousands of Africans who were now needed to be brought into the Americas for the slave power to produce, harvest, and maintain this new crop. So tobacco is a key factor in reshaping who would be a part of the new English-speaking nation and the role they would play in the society that emerged. Now let's move on to Massachusetts. Okay, so during the first 2 decades of the 1600s, many in England were coming to see the country as overpopulated. Changes in agriculture were forcing people out of subsistence farming and into the cities. England's economy, though, became stagnant. So what better outlet for an excessive population than the new colonies across the scary Atlantic Ocean? Now, King James especially wanted to see one group of people cross the ocean, the Protestant extremists who were forever agitating him for more change in the Church of England. The Protestants who wanted a more complete reformation or reformation of the Church of England, they became known as the Puritans, and the Puritans wanted change, much more change. Now, there's another group, so make sure you know the Puritans wanted change within the church. But the other group, okay, are called separatists. And, they thought that the church was hopelessly corrupt and that there's really no need to reform it because it's not possible. So they need to separate completely and create their own religious communities. The separatists were constantly in trouble with the authorities since everyone in England was expected to belong to the Anglican Church and attend its worship services every Sunday. So, the separatists are also known as the Pilgrims, kind of more commonly known as the Pilgrims. And they're going to found the second permanent English colony in North America at Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. So the first permanent English colony is Jamestown in 1607, and the second is Plymouth in Massachusetts in 1620. Now, the origins of Plymouth lay in a small community of separatists who left England from Holland in 1607. But the separatists still considered themselves English and worried about raising their children in Holland. They feared that they may become more Dutch than they were English citizens. And they still want to be English. They just want the church to be fixed. Okay? So they eventually decided to secure a grant from the Virginia Company, and they hired a ship, the Mayflower, and set sail from Plymouth, England, with 102 passengers. Okay, please keep in mind, since they hired the Mayflower, that means once it drops them off, it's going to leave them, and they're there, and there's like no boat to get home. Now, after a stormy 2-month travel across the Atlantic, they reached a destination far north of where they meant to. They didn't get to go to the Virginia colony. That's where they were heading for, okay? So this led them to the realization that they were not in an area where with government. Thus, they promised to combine ourselves together into a civil body for the better ordering and preservation, okay? And these words are coming from the Mayflower Compact as we know it, and the beginning of government by a constant people. It's like the first time in America you see self-governing. And they actually do this on the Mayflower before they get off. They write this Mayflower Compact. Now, the Pilgrims' first landing in November of 1620 was on the outer end of Cape Cod. That's how far north they land. But by December, however, they had moved across the Cape to a place named Plymouth, or what they called Plymouth, where their high hills offered protection and a large level area that led down to the harbor, which was a good place to build a town. Now, Plymouth was empty when the Pilgrims landed because most of the natives had actually been wiped out by the 1616 epidemic. But the Pilgrims had arrived too late to build the kind of shelters they needed for the New England winter. Thus, during the winter of 1620 to 1621, about half of the community died from disease, the cold, or even malnutrition. So some families are going to be wiped out altogether because of a New England winter. But in the spring of 1620, their luck changed. An Indian very boldly, walked right up to them into the heart of the little town of Plymouth, and he said in English, "Welcome, Englishmen." The Pilgrims concluded, the native had been to England and could describe many of the locations to the colonists, but more important, he taught them how to find food and how to survive. Now the Pilgrims then concluded an agreement with the natives that led to 54 years of peace and an amazing development in the Americas. In the fall of 1621, the first successful harvest was accomplished, and the first Thanksgiving was actually a week-long time of feasting on the fruits of the harvest and on the turkeys and the duck and the geese and the deers and all the stews that were made when that one Native American who spoke English walked up to the Pilgrims and taught them how to farm the area. Now, let's talk about another Massachusetts Bay colony, okay? Now, another group of religious rebels from England were not far behind the Pilgrims, and those were the Puritans. We've already talked about them a little bit. Remember, they want to change the church, not make a brand new one. Okay, now the Puritan reformers who wanted to stay within the Church of England and change it were also having a hard time in the 1620s. They were referred to as the Puritans. Advocating reform within the established church became more difficult and more dangerous. The Puritans controlled a corporation called the Massachusetts Bay Company, and they set out to explore and settle in North America. Now, the Puritans planted their first colony in Salem, just north of present-day Boston, in 1629, and then they are soon going to want to expand out of Salem. Now, John Winthrop was an enthusiastic and devoted Puritan who was invited to be the governor of the new colony, Massachusetts Bay. And in the spring of 1630, 14 ships left England for Massachusetts Bay with their new governor and their charter on board. By the end of the summer, more than 1,000 people and 200 cattle had landed in Massachusetts. The Puritans also had a clear sense of purpose. As Winthrop said, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." And we will come back to that. His City Upon a Hill sermon is very important. Now, the Puritan Commonwealth in New England could be a new model for Old England, okay? The Puritans value literacy. If salvation depended on a personal encounter with the Christian faith, then Puritans need to be able to read the Bible and minister and magistrate on, these messages. So they're, pretty highly literate. In 1636, only 6 years after Boston was founded, Harvard University is created. And every township was provided with a school. Okay, now the Puritans of Massachusetts had their differences with one another, though, which resulted in several splits. This resulted in the creation of Connecticut. All right. So, 2 years later, with permission from the authorities in Boston, the Hartford colonists established a formal government for their colony known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Excuse me. This document offered more men the right to vote than did the rules in Massachusetts. Some have considered it the first written constitution of the Americas, actually. Now, more trouble for the Puritans. You have Roger Williams, who, really advocated for the freedom of the conscience for every individual, which is kind of this unique idea, in the 1600s. So Roger Williams was a supporter of the Puritan cause in England and arrived in Boston in 1631, only a year after the city's founding. But he quickly got in trouble with the Boston's magistrates because he asserted that civil authority could not enforce religious laws, including a law against blasphemy. So in 1635, he was convicted of an erroneous opinion, and in 1636, he ended up establishing a colony called Providence, where he invited all of those who were distressed of conscience to his colony that would be the first to separate church and state and grant full liberty to people of any religious opinion. And Rhode Island actually becomes the name of the colony, and it is a haven for religious dissenters. In addition, Anne Hutchinson caused stir with her charismatic preaching and her belief that God's inspiration could be more immediate than most Puritans believed. The Puritans believed that everyone should read the Bible every single day, but they also expected all interpretation of the Bible to follow a certain path. Also, to the Puritans, only men were supposed to preach. So Hutchinson said that she herself had received a direct revelation from God to preach, and so the Puritans banished her from the colony. She and her followers made their way first to Roger Williams' colony and then to Dutch New Amsterdam, which would be New York. Now, let's talk about a few more colonies. So Virginia's the first, and then you've got Massachusetts that, the English create, which is their second part. All right, so we're going to start with Maryland. All right, Maryland represented something new. So it's a proprietary colony, which was essentially owned by one person and then all of their heirs. All right. So the proprietor might allow others to own land within their colony and might take advice from local officials, but the whole colony is pretty much private property, and as such could be passed from generation to generation within that proprietor's family. King Charles I established this model when he offered to give Maryland to George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore was a devout Catholic, and Catholics are being persecuted in England, but King Charles was sympathetic despite popular opposition. So Lord Baltimore, with the king's support, was determined to establish Maryland as a haven for English Catholics. So in 1649, Maryland granted freedom of worship to all Christians, including Protestants of any persuasion. In 1635, they agreed to call a representative assembly. They agreed to give every European settler 100 acres of land, another 100 for each additional adult member of the family, and 50 acres for each child. This head right system made moving to Maryland very popular. With tobacco came the need for more workers in Maryland. Thus, African slavery came early to Maryland. In 1661, Maryland was the first colony to formalize laws governing slavery. The laws included the stipulation that slaves inherited their status from their mother, and that slavery for those, so pretty much those born into slavery, that was their life. All right, a couple other ones, Connecticut and New Hampshire. Okay, so Connecticut united with New Haven, another New England colony in 1662, which we're not really going to talk about, so you just know Connecticut. Okay, now the fundamental orders of Connecticut were adopted by the Colony Council, which described the government setup and powers. Now, the orders have features of a written constitution and are considered by some the first written constitution of the Western world. But New Hampshire became a separate colony under a royal governor in 1691. Vermont and Maine are not created until later, so please keep that in mind, like as you're looking at the maps here. Okay. All right, pretty much wraps up Connecticut and New Hampshire. Now let's look at New York and New Jersey. All right, New York was settled before Maryland, but not by the English. Okay, it became English only after the English Civil War of 1642 to 1649. Okay, what is now New York was settled by the Netherlands or Holland, a new Protestant country carved out of what had been Spanish possession land in the late 1500s. In 1626, there you go, the Dutch built a settlement and commercial center, and they called it New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, which, according to legend, was purchased from local Indians from 6 Dutch guiders. Okay. Now, anyways, religion was to be enforced and created uniformity. Okay, so they really hoped to enforce it, which meant they banned the Jews. But New Amsterdam soon became a haven for religious dissenters, including the Jews, Catholics, Quakers, and Muslims. It was also home to Dutch, German, French, Swedish, Portuguese, and English settlers. So from the very beginning, New York City has been New York City. The Dutch, too, were active in the slave trade and had the largest number of African slaves in North America in the 1600s. In 1664, King Charles II gave New Amsterdam to his younger brother, even though the Dutch had already settled the land. This didn't really bother the king or his brother. So having been given the colony, the king's brother sent a fleet to New Amsterdam to just pretty much take it over. And there was very little resistance when he got there. Now, the king's brother divided the colony, keeping New York for himself, and he ended up giving New Jersey to 2 political allies. For the rest of the 1600s, New Jersey remained a colony of small farms of limited profit to its proprietors, although it attracted a diverse group of European settlers because its proprietors offered land at low prices and gave settlers a significant religious and political freedoms. All right, let's move a little further south to Pennsylvania and Delaware. Now, Pennsylvania was established as a proprietary colony and a haven for the persecuted religious groups while being open to all. Pennsylvania's proprietor was William Penn, who was a member of an insurgent religious community known as the Quakers, because they supposedly trembled or quaked at the name of God. Quakers broke with much of the traditional theology and religious practice of the day. When the Quakers gathered to worship, they sat in silence until someone was moved by the Spirit to speak. They did not have a formal clergy and gave women equal standing with men in their community. As well, the Quakers were absolute pacifists who would not serve in the military. Thus, Penn insisted on a peaceful trade with the Native Americans. Despite all of his commitment to peace with the Indian, Penn did not outlaw slavery in his colony, and as early as 1684, 2 years after the founding of the colony, 150 African slaves arrived. Slaves quickly came to have a key role as household servants, and by the 1700s made up 1/6 of Philadelphia's population. The charter in 1701 also allowed the 3 of the most southern counties of Pennsylvania to create their own assembly, which becomes the colony of Delaware. And there's little Delaware. Is the first Europeans to settle in Delaware were actually from Sweden or Finland, but it's made out of those little southern colonies of Pennsylvania. All right, on to the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. Okay, so Charles II rewarded 8 of his supporters and sought to secure England's land claims by creating the colony named Carolina. So North and South Carolina used to be one. All right. The proprietors developed an elaborate system of government that prescribed a hierarchical society with themselves at the top, followed by local gentry, then poor white servants with African slaves at the bottom. Carolina is going to end up being divided. So the North was most of the settlers mostly were relatively poor white farmers from Virginia, whereas the South was a large-scale rice-growing community, and so they were richer. And they also had Charleston. So much of the colony's commercial success focused on the city and the harbor at Charleston, which falls in South Carolina, because this was a really good harbor and port to trade with the British Caribbean colonies. The split between the North and the South was formalized when King George II officially divided the colony into North and South Carolina in 1729. And our last colony is Georgia. Now, Georgia was founded in 1733 for idealistic reasons. James Oglethorpe, a war hero in England, wanted to create a place where the poorest of England's poor, those indebted prisoners because they couldn't repay what they owed, could find new lives and just start over. So he also believed that England needed a strong frontier colony on the border with the Spanish because Florida is owned by the Spanish. These settlers, peoples whose alternative might well be prison, would be inspired to not only farm and become farmers, but also soldiers within the frontier border. Go to Georgia. You don't have to sit in prison. So Oglethorpe excluded Catholics, though, who might be secretly loyal to Catholic Spain. So that defeats the purpose of the buffer zone. And Africans, free or slaves, since they might be tempted to run away to the south, to Florida, so they didn't have to work. Now, let's talk about some of those people that worked, whether they were African slaves or indentured servants. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived at Jamestown. John Rolfe, anxious to expand the workforce for his tobacco farm, traded food supplies to the Dutch in return for 20 African slaves. This marked the beginning of African slaves in the colonies. Now, many think of slavery as a static institution, but the nature of slavery changed often. For many Americans, the image of slavery is that of the large plantation that existed in the South between 1800 and 1860. But understanding the development of slavery in the United States requires more careful observation. In the earliest years, slavery, though very difficult, was actually less harsh and hopeless than it became after about 1680. The first generation of African slaves in Virginia often worked side by side, not only with English and Irish servants, but many of whom also had little choice about coming to America. Race was always a factor, but racial lines were blurred in early colonial America. Servants and slaves lived together, created new families together, and resisted together when they felt ill-treated. In small farms of the Chesapeake and the middle colonies, slaves also worked side by side with those who owned the land and with indentured servants who were working for a specific number of years to pay off the cost of their travel to America. Some of these indentured servants came seeking a better life, often came as an alternative to prison in England. During a term, an indentured servant was treated much like a slave, and indentured servants could be bought and sold and were often whipped. The difference between an indentured servant and slavery was at the end of a term ranging from 4 to 7 years, the servant was free, whereas a slave was always a slave. Until the late 1640s, the majority of indentured servants actually died before completing their term, and even after earning their freedom, most of the newly freed servants were not able to earn very much, although a few did prosper and end up joining the elite. Since an English indentured servant cost about half as much as African slaves did, since neither tended to live very long, Virginians initially preferred indentured servants. Servants and slaves often intermarried and saw themselves as a united group. Now, African slaves dreamed of a day when they might be free to own their own land, and that dream was not an impossible one in the early 1600s. Slavery developed in the northern colonies as it did in those in the South, coming to Massachusetts fairly soon after it came to Virginia. Now, northern slaves, like many southern slaves of the 1600s, were much more fully integrated into the European and American society and had less contact with fellow Americans and African traditions and had much more freedom than the later generations. But slavery is going to continue, and if you don't know what it turns into, we'll talk about it as we, move further into the class. All right, and let's move on to, the last part, which is the colonial wars and just the fighting that happens. So, let's start with rebellion in New England, and we're going to start with King Philip's War. Okay, so the tensions that led the Pilgrims and the Puritans to flee England erupted into a full-scale civil war in the 1640s. When the civil wars ended, a new king, King Charles II, ruled in England until 1660, and the tensions began to spill over into the colonies then. As England's American colonies were founded and began to grow, they were often violent places that reflected old and new tensions. King Philip's War in Massachusetts was one of the most vicious wars ever fought in North America. Now, thus far, the Pilgrims and the natives had experienced an unusual peace and harmony between the two cultures. The Puritans did not maintain peace for long, though. When a captain was killed in 1637, the Puritans responded extremely harshly. They allied with other Native American tribes and attacked one Native American fortress, burning the houses and attacking everyone and anyone who survived they sold into slavery. Then the New Englanders pushed for converting the natives to their religion. This, along with the constant growth of Europeans in New England area, continued to create tensions. Soon, rumors began of war preparations and conflict in New England between several native tribes, and the English broke out for 1 year. Now, within this year, thousands died, and some native tribes are going to actually be completely wiped out. Now, down in Virginia, you have Bacon's Rebellion. So, Virginia was also engulfed with violence. Bacon's Rebellion illustrated the instability of early colonial life and alliances that were constantly shifting. By 1660, Virginia had 40,000 colonists, including a small elite and many poor workers, Africans and Indians, some slaves, some free, and current or former English indentured servants. Sir William Berkeley was the royal governor of Virginia from 1642 to the 1670s. He brought order to the colony, but it was an aristocratic order. He had an inner circle of government and retained most of the profits from the tobacco trade, no matter who actually grew it. The corruption generated increasing tensions among others at the social divide increased between the rich white and the poor whites. So soon in 1675, resentment came to a head, and the economy was in the doldrums. Neither the corn crop nor the tobacco crop was doing well. At that point, that's where Nathaniel Bacon comes in, who had recently arrived in Virginia from a very prosperous English family and already was one of the largest landowners in the western part of the colony. And so he organizes a militia to attack the Indians. Bacon and his followers had heard of news of King Philip's War in Massachusetts and New England, where many tribes had united and then they were more powerful. They feared unity among Virginia's tribes had no intention of discriminating between friendly and unfriendly Indians, so Bacon and his militia began attacking every Indian tribe indiscriminately, whether, they were going to hurt the English or not. Governor Berkeley, however, believed that Virginia needed to be friendly with the tribes on its frontier to protect it from the hostile tribes who lived further west, and he refused to support Bacon's militia, and Bacon refused to have his militia disperse. So Berkeley had Bacon arrested, and then he released him. Well, Bacon then marched his what was known as a ragtag army of free Africans, slaves, and poor whites into Jamestown, and he set the whole town on fire. In the face of the militia, Governor Berkeley fled, calling for help from England. The crowd sent about 1,000 English troops that had no patience with rebellions, so most of the rebels surrendered once the English troops got there, and they ended up being pardoned. Now, in 1676, Bacon died at the age of 29 from dysentery. 23 leaders of the short-lived rebellion would end up being hung, and Virginia's poor white had been crushed. Bacon's rebellion, though, illustrated the complexity of American history and was a major turning point in the history of slavery in Virginia. In 1677, the Indians of Western Virginia ceded their remaining lands to the colony and moved further west, continuing a process of Indian removal that would eventually span the continent. So, to just wrap everything up, the nations of Europe kind of showed little interest in establishing settlements north of Mexico until the early 1600s. The coast of what is now the United States of America served as little more than a way station for cod fishermen throughout most of the 1500s. But in 1585, some English investors began to take a second look and see the merit in establishing colonies in North America, not only to trade with the Indians, but also to Christianize them and enlist them as an ally against the English's rival, Spain. Now, the first successful and permanent English colony was established in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. The colony would not have been able to last without the leadership of the English adventurer John Smith or the assistance of the Powhatan Native American tribe. Unlike Jamestown, which had been established as a commercial enterprise by the Virginia Company, other colonies of the area in present New England were established as refuges for Englanders who were persecuted due to their religious ideals. Now, after the establishment of Virginia and New England, other English colonies were established quickly and successfully. All of the English colonies did permit slavery of African Americans and American Indians. However, during most of the 1600s, slaves actually worked and lived side by side with the indentured servants, and we see that there is a little bit of chaos in English North America, and that there are some conflicts. So that pretty much wraps up the second set of notes for Unit 1.